Hey class, it's time to look at how we're going to do our validity analyses for our class project. So just a couple quick words on validity to think about as you continue this process. Remember that validity asks the question or tries to answer the question, does our test adequately measure the variable we're trying to measure? Does it get at what we're trying to get at? And there are a lot of different kinds of validity that we've talked about, a lot of ways of establishing validity. But for the purposes of this project, we're really interested in two kinds of validity. One is construct validity. So remember that constructs are latent variables. We call them latent because we can't actually observe them directly, but we know that they exist as a part of the human process. And so how do you determine if a test adequately measures something that you can't see? That the process of establishing that kind of validity is the process of construct validity. So establishing construct validity involves building evidence step by step, and you do this by hypothesizing or predicting relationships between the scores on your new test and other variables that theoretically or through previous literature searches you know should be correlated or related to your variable of interest in different ways. So the two major kinds of construct validity are convergent validity and discriminant validity. So remember that convergent validity is when your new measure correlates well with other already established tests that are believed to measure the same construct. So, for example, for the group who's doing a new measure of stress in college students, you're trying to measure the variable stress, and one way that you might determine or provide evidence that your new measure does a good job at doing that is if scores on your new measure of stress correlate highly with scores from other tests that purport to measure the same thing, stress. We also establish construct validity by looking at discriminant validity. And this is where we say, okay, we have this new measure of stress, and it demonstrates some unique quality. It's able to uniquely measure stress in a new way. There are a lot of different ways that you can look at discriminant validity. You can look at related constructs that should have correlations or have predicted correlations with your variable of interest, but that shouldn't be identical, that shouldn't be completely the same or have very high correlations close to 1. You could also make predictions about discriminant validity in terms of what your test shouldn't measure or what it should negatively correlate with. One other type of validity that you might be having a plan for this particular project is criterion validity. And we talked about two kinds of criterion validity, but for this project we're really only having the capability of looking at one, and that is concurrent validity. So recall that criterion validity is established through a process of showing that the scores on the test correlate again in predicted, hypothesized ways with other variables that are measured at the same time. Okay. So let's talk about the process of testing for validity for your class project. Okay, so the first thing that I want you guys to do is take a moment and think about the three types of validity that your group has proposed to test. Get those types in mind. The next thing you need to do is recall or determine what your hypotheses are about the way that you predict test scores on your new measure should be related to these three types of measurements that you're trying to use to establish validity. So if you haven't already done so, write down your hypotheses for that now. And finally, I want you to recall what is the validity statistic. So how are we going to test for validity using our data in SPSS? If you need to, feel free to go back to your notes on reliability and validity from earlier in the class, or you can look at your book now. Okay, so once you've done that, I want to tell you a little bit about my plan that I'm going to use to take you through the process. So my plan is to focus on construct validity. So I say my hypotheses are the following. If my scale does actually measure the degree to which a person is aware of their physiological signs of arousal, I would expect the following relationships. First, I would expect that the sexual arousal awareness scale scores should be positively correlated with a measure of sexual desire. And I expect that based on previous research and theory about what sexual arousal, how it would be related to sexual desire. I also predict that scale scores of the SSA should be negatively correlated with guilty feelings about sex. And again, I hypothesize that because of my literature review and knowing that sex guilt is often associated with suppressed interest in sexuality, which I would expect then to also be related to decreased awareness of signs of sexual arousal. And finally, I predict that my SAA scale score should be only moderately correlated with a related type of scale, but that doesn't focus on sexual arousal awareness. And that scale is a body awareness scale, which measures just how generally aware people are of their body in general, not about these specific kinds of physiological. Now you'll notice that actually all of my predicted correlations for validity really focus on concepts of discriminant validity because I haven't included another scale that tries to measure sexual arousal awareness. And that's because that scale doesn't exist. Many of you are going to have convergent scales that you can use to also establish convergent validity. Okay, so let's talk about how we would do that. At this point, I'm going to go into SPSS. And at this point in your data file, make sure that you have created that, again, that you have a good clean data file, that everything that needs to be reverse scored is reverse scored, and that also you've created your scales for your new test and also any scales that you're using to do validity tests. So for example, you can see here I have, these are the items, the individual items for my arousal awareness scale, 1, 2, 3 so far. And then I've got, this is the body awareness questionnaire, which is one of my validity tests, and you can see this is item by item, and I have, that's the data that I have. But let's go on ahead and go all the way to the end. You can see that I've already created the scale scores for the scales that I'm going to use in my validity tests. So here's my arousal awareness scale score. This is my sexual desire, my body awareness, and then this is the sex guilt. And if you need to recall how to do a scale, remember that what you're going to do is you're going to go to the top, you're going to go to transform, and you're going to compute a variable. That's how you make the scale. So let me reset that. You would type in your scale name here, and then you're just going to add all of your items over here. And remember, if you've reverse scored an item, you want to make sure that you add your reverse scored item instead of the original item to make sure that you have a nice, clean, accurate scale. Okay, but I've already done that, so I'm going to cancel out. So you should know now, from going back to your notes, that the validity coefficient is correlation. So what we're looking at is predicted correlations between our new scale, scores on our new scale, and our criterion or our additional scales that we're using to look for convergent or discriminant validity. And so to do this, we're going to run actually one analysis that will allow us to do this. So we're going to run some correlations. So we want to go up to Analyze in SPSS, click on Analyze, and then go down here to Correlate. Now we want a bivariate correlation. So just click on that. All right. So this should come up blank for you, and what you're going to want to do is just pull over your new scale, and I would do that first so that it shows up in the first column. So this is my arousal awareness scale. That's my new scale. And then I'm going to pull over any individual item or scale score that I'm using to test for validity. So all of mine are scale scores. I don't have any individual items that I'm using as validity tests. Some of you do, so make sure that you pull over that individual item if that's the case for you and your group. So here I have sexual desire, which is my first proposed relationship. Then I'm going to pull over sex guilt just because that was the second one that I proposed to you. And then finally the body awareness questionnaire, which will be the third. I do have a Pearson's correlation coefficient here, and I am going to click OK. And what I see here is my results section with correlations. And so remember that you read this. This shows, this box is the correlation between arousal and arousal awareness. It should be a 1. That's identical. This box is going to tell you the correlation between a person's arousal awareness and their sexual desire. And you can see that it's a positive, significant positive correlation of a 0.475. That is as I predicted, so that's good. Here we have the correlation between the arousal awareness scale and sex guilt. And you can see that it is a significant, as evidenced by our little asterisks here and by the significance test here, of a negative 0.288. Again, I did hypothesize a negative correlation between those two, and I see a significant negative correlation, so that's good for my validity test. And then finally we have arousal awareness and body awareness generally. I predicted a moderate positive correlation between the two, and what I see is a significant positive correlation of a 0.347. Okay, so let's go back and look at how to think about this. Okay, so when I'm reporting on my validity, I can say that sexual arousal awareness and sexual desire were correlated. The validity coefficient is R equals 0.475. I pulled that straight from that table. SAA and sex guilt, R equals negative 0.288, and that was consistent, again, with my hypothesis. And finally, our SAA scale score and general body awareness was also significantly positively correlated, R equals 0.347, so that, again, supported my proposed hypothesis for validity testing. There's one more step that I can take here, and that's looking at the proportion of variance in these criterion variables here, sexual desire, sex guilt, and general body awareness, that a score on sexual arousal awareness sort of accounts for or is associated with. And remember, we do that by calculating a coefficient of determination. So recall that the coefficient of determination just roughly tells us the amount of variation in our criterion that is explained by a predictor variable. In this case, our criterion are our validity tests that are predicted by our predictor, our new test of a psychological construct. And the coefficient of determination is just R squared, so it's a squared R to get our coefficient of determination. So let's see what that looks like. I can say, knowing my validity coefficients, that sexual arousal awareness explains approximately 22.6% of the variance in sexual desire, and I know that because R squared equals 0.226, and so I'm just going to turn that into a percentage by taking it times 100. It explains 8.3% of the variance in sex guilt because R squared equals 0.083, and it explains 12.1% of the variance in general body awareness, so R squared equals 0.121. That's how I get that. Remember that validity coefficients, there's no hard and fast rule for validity coefficients. In fact, validity coefficients where R is equal to about 0.3 or above is considered to be a pretty strong predictive relationship.